Boarding pass, sweetheart. The words delivered with that fake saccharine sweetness dripped like poison. 12-year-old Kelly, EV lines subtly hidden under her designer jacket, looked up from her college textbook. Again, this wasn't the first time, but something felt different, more pointed. See, here's the thing. Kelly knew her rights, knew the FAA regs better than half the crew. What they didn't know, her dad practically wrote those regs. This wasn't about procedure. It was about a little black girl daring to sit in first class. The kind of quiet rage that simmers. What they didn't realize? That quiet strength held a compassion, a deep well of empathy that would soon rewrite airline policy. They had no idea her quiet kindness would change everything. Boarding pass, sweetheart. The words delivered with that fake saccharine sweetness dripped like poison. 12-year-old Kelly, IV lines subtly hidden under her designer jacket, looked up from her college textbook. Again, this wasn't the first time, but something felt different, more pointed. See, here's the thing. Kelly knew her rights, knew the FAA regs better than half the crew. What they didn't know, her dad practically wrote those regs. This wasn't about procedure. It was about a little black girl daring to sit in first class, the kind of quiet rage that simmers. What they didn't realize, that quiet strength held a compassion, a deep well of empathy that would soon rewrite airline policy. They had no idea her quiet kindness would change everything. Kelly Bennett, remember that name? At 12, she was a paradox, fragile yet fiercely independent, a medical marvel wrapped in preteen innocence. Pulmonary arterial hypertension, PAH, was the invisible monster gnawing at her lungs, a cruel legacy from her mother, Sarah. Sarah, a bright, dedicated nurse, had succumbed to PAC when Kelly was barely 6, leaving Darius, her husband and Kelly's father, with a heart full of grief and a vow he intended to keep. Darius Bennett wasn't just any grieving father. He was Major Darius Bennett, former Air Force pilot, now a senior director at the FAA. He knew the skies, knew the rules, knew how to navigate the labyrinthine bureaucracy that governed air travel. When Kelly was diagnosed with PAH at 7, Darius channeled his grief and his considerable influence into ensuring she lived as full a life as possible. Every specialist consulted, every cutting-edge treatment explored, every possible accommodation made. He couldn't lose her too. And Kelly? She embraced life with a quiet determination that belied her delicate condition. School was a battleground she conquered with honors. The debate team trembled before her sharp intellect and unwavering resolve. At 12, college acceptance letters were already piling up, a testament to her dream of becoming a biomedical engineer, a dream fueled by the very technology that kept her alive. To the casual observer, Kelly appeared to be a typical, intelligent, well-dressed young girl. She'd mastered the art of masking her illness, of subtly concealing the oxygen concentrator that was her constant companion. The whirring of the machine became white noise to her, a familiar lullaby against the constant threat of breathlessness. She wore clothing that cleverly concealed the tubes and wires. Breathing techniques minimized the gasping, and she carried herself with a quiet dignity that deflected unwanted attention. This invisibility was usually a shield, allowing her to move through the world without pitying glances or intrusive questions. But on this particular day, March 15th, it became a dangerous liability. Kelly was on her way to Denver for an interview at the Colorado School of Engineering, a pivotal moment in her meticulously crafted plan for the future. This wasn't just about early admission. It was about finding a place where she belonged, a community of innovators dedicated to solving the very medical challenges she faced every day. Darius had orchestrated this trip with military precision. Countless phone calls, emails, and meetings, FAA medical clearances, airline approvals, doctor's letters, a paper trail thicker than a novel, all attesting to Kelly's right to travel with her life-sustaining equipment. Seat 2A, carefully selected for optimal cabin pressure and proximity to the crew. Airport security pre-briefed. Gate agents armed with documentation. Every detail scrutinized, every contingency planned. Kelly boarded Flight 229 during pre-boarding, her movements practiced and efficient. Oxygen concentrator secured, connections checked, alarms tested, emergency medications within easy reach. The familiar hum of the machine filled the small space, a constant reminder of her precarious existence. Passengers streamed past, most oblivious to the quiet drama unfolding in seat 2A. To them, she was just another young girl engrossed in her studies, maybe a high schooler acing their college course. Kelly pulled out her biomedical engineering textbook and began reviewing respiratory support systems, mentally preparing to discuss the intricacies of her own equipment with the interview panel. She understood her condition on a level that surpassed most doctors, her unique perspective shaped by both patient and engineer, user and designer, survivor and innovator. The flight filled with business travelers, families, and college students, all eager to reach their destinations. No one seemed to notice the quiet black girl in first class, engrossed in her studies, her life subtly sustained by a humming machine. But then, Jessica Morrison approached. Jessica, a seasoned flight attendant with 8 years under her belt, prided herself on her professionalism. What Jessica couldn't seem to shake, however, were her implicit assumptions about race, class, and privilege. As she performed her pre-flight check, her gaze snagged on Kelly. The sight of a young black girl, alone, nestled in first class with what appeared to be sophisticated electronic equipment, jarred her internal schema. In Jessica's limited worldview, young black passengers didn't typically occupy the premium cabin. They certainly didn't possess expensive medical devices, and they definitely didn't pore over advanced textbooks. Subconsciously, she filed Kelly as an anomaly, a mismatch. Instead of adhering to protocol, inquiring about the equipment, requesting documentation, Jessica acted on her biases. "Excuse me, sweetheart," she said, her voice laced with a saccharine sweetness that grated against Kelly's nerves. "I need to see your boarding pass." Kelly looked up, momentarily surprised. "I already showed it at the gate." "Well," Jessica pressed on, her smile hardening, "I'm going to need to see it again, along with some photo identification to verify you're supposed to be in first class." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Other passengers were noticing. The air crackled with tension. Kelly reached for her bag, a knot forming in her stomach. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. She knew the airline protocols, the legal protections afforded to passengers with disabilities, but the blatant scrutiny, the underlying accusation, was unsettling. "The problem," Jessica retorted, her voice rising, "is that I need to verify you belong here. This is first class, and frankly, you don't exactly look like our typical first-class passenger." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Kelly felt a flush creep up her neck as heads turned, eyes scrutinized. 12 years old, traveling alone, tethered to a life support machine, and being publicly humiliated because of her appearance. "I have all my documentation," Kelly managed, her voice barely a whisper. "My father booked this seat specifically because of my medical condition." "Medical condition?" Jessica interrupted, her eyes finally registering the oxygen concentrator. "What exactly is all this equipment? And why wasn't I informed about a medical passenger in first class?" Kelly tried to explain about her PIH, about the concentrator, about the reams of paperwork validating her right to be there. But Jessica wasn't listening. She saw only a young black girl with suspicious equipment making unbelievable claims. "I'm going to need you to move to economy," Jessica announced, her tone brooking no argument. "We can't have unauthorized medical equipment in first class, and I need these seats available for passengers who actually paid for first-class service." The implication was clear. This black girl couldn't possibly afford first class, couldn't possibly have legitimate medical needs, couldn't possibly belong. Kelly's hands began to tremble, not from anger, but from the insidious onset of respiratory distress. Stress was a trigger, and the humiliation, the judgment, the dismissal of her medical needs was constricting her airways. "Please," she pleaded, her voice strained. "I can't move. My equipment is calibrated for this cabin pressure. I have all the documentation." "Listen, little girl," Jessica snapped, her patience depleted. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this is first class. You need to gather your things and move to the back of the plane where you belong." Where you belong. The words echoed in Kelly's ears, chilling her more effectively than any winter wind. Her pulmonary arteries constricted, her oxygen saturation plummeted, Her heart hammered against her ribs. The carefully maintained balance that kept her alive was crumbling. I can't breathe properly, Kelly gasped, reaching for her emergency inhaler. Please, I just need to stay in my assigned seat. That's enough, Jessica declared, her face flushed with a mixture of anger and something that resembled fear. Security! In that moment, Jessica Morrison sealed her fate and nearly signed Kelly's death warrant. She was summoning security to remove a 12-year-old black girl on life support from first class, all because of her own prejudiced assumptions. A businessman in seat 1B, David Chin, had been observing the unfolding drama with growing unease. As an Asian American who had experienced his own share of prejudice, he recognized the insidious nature of Jessica's actions. "Excuse me," he interjected, his voice calm but firm. "This young lady appears to be in medical distress. Perhaps we should focus on that instead of seat assignments." Jessica whirled around, irritated by the interruption. "Sir, this doesn't concern you. I'm handling a passenger who's trying to claim a seat she didn't pay for." "Have you actually looked at her boarding pass?" David challenged, his eyes narrowing. "Have you verified her seat assignment before accusing her of fraud?" It was then that Jessica realized she had been so consumed by Kelly's race and appearance that she had neglected to follow basic procedures. She had allowed her biases to override her training, but it was too late. Kelly was now in a full-blown medical crisis. The oxygen concentrator emitted a high-pitched warning. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. Her lips were turning a disturbing shade of blue. "Something's wrong," David exclaimed, his voice laced with urgency. "This girl is in serious medical distress." Passengers craned their necks, witnessing the chilling spectacle. A 12-year-old girl connected to medical equipment, struggling to breathe, while a flight attendant demanded she move to the back of the plane. And then Kelly's phone rang. The caller ID displaying two words that would change everything. "Dad, FAA, executive line." Kelly's phone was ringing, but she was too distressed to answer. Her oxygen saturation was plummeting. Her equipment was blaring alarms, and Jessica Morrison was still demanding she move. David Chin, seeing her distress, gently took the phone. "Hello, Kelly." A pause. "Sweetheart, is everything okay?" Then a note of alarm. "Your plane should have taken off by now." David Chin took a deep breath and spoke clearly. "Sir, this isn't Kelly. My name is David Chin. I'm a passenger in seat 1B. Your daughter is having some kind of medical emergency, and the flight attendant is trying to force her to move seats." A beat of silence. Then a voice, sharp and authoritative. "Put me on speaker, now." David pressed the speakerphone, and the voice of Major Darius Bennett filled the first-class cabin. "This is Major Darius Bennett, Senior Director of Aviation Safety Operations, Federal Aviation Administration. Who am I speaking to?" Jessica Morrison's face drained of color. She recognized that tone, the weight of federal authority, the kind of power that could shatter careers with a single phone call. This is Jessica Morrison, Senior Flight Attendant on Flight 229. Ms. Morrison, I need you to explain to me why my daughter, who is traveling with federally approved medical equipment and complete documentation, is apparently being asked to move from her assigned first-class seat." Jessica stammered, searching for an explanation. "Sir, I was just following protocol." "What protocol?" Darius's voice cut through the cabin like a laser. "What protocol allows you to question a passenger's seat assignment based on their appearance? What protocol allows you to ignore medical equipment that is clearly visible and properly documented?" Kelly's breathing grew more labored. The stress of the confrontation, compounded by her father's voice booming over the speakerphone, was overwhelming her fragile system. "Dad," she gasped, her voice barely audible. I can't. It's hard to breathe." The change in Darius Bennett's voice was instantaneous and terrifying. The steely FAA official vanished, replaced by a desperate father. "Kelly, baby, I need you to focus on your breathing. Is your concentrator working properly?" "Yes, but she wants to move me. Cabin pressure, different altitude." David Chin, witnessing Kelly's distress, turned to Jessica Morrison, his face etched with fury. "Are you insane?" he roared, his voice echoing through the cabin. "This child is on life support. Her father is a federal aviation official, and you're trying to move her because you don't think she looks like she belongs in first class." The cabin erupted in murmurs. cell phones appeared, capturing the unfolding drama. The hashtag Wash Flight 229 was poised to explode on social media. "Sir," Jessica stammered, desperately trying to regain control, "I need to maintain order in the cabin." "Maintain order?" David exploded. "You're discriminating against a child with a disability. You're endangering her life because of your racial bias." The words racial bias hung in the air like a thunderclap. Every passenger was a witness. This wasn't just about seating arrangements anymore. It was about a young black child fighting for her life against the insidious force of prejudice. Meanwhile, Darius Bennett, back in his Washington office, was unleashing the full force of the federal government. "Sarah," he barked into his intercom, summoning his assistant, "I need you to ground Flight 229 immediately. Medical emergency involving crew discrimination against a disabled minor." "Sir?" Sarah's voice was laced with confusion. "Do it now. Use my federal authority. That's my daughter on that plane, and some flight attendant is trying to kill her with ignorance and racism." Within seconds, the wheels of the FAA were turning with unprecedented speed. Sarah Chen made 3 phone calls that would resonate throughout the aviation industry for years to come. Call 1, Air Traffic Control Command Center. Flight 229 at O'Hare is grounded under direct federal order. Do not allow departure. Call 2, O'Hare Emergency Medical. Dispatch pediatric emergency team to Gate 42. Federal official's daughter in medical crisis due to crew actions. Call 3, Airline Corporate Headquarters. You have a discrimination incident involving a federal official's disabled daughter. Your crew is about to face federal charges. Back on the plane, Kelly's condition was rapidly deteriorating. The stress, the humiliation, the sheer physical exertion of arguing while tethered to life support was pushing her closer to respiratory failure. "Dad," she gasped into the phone, her voice barely a whisper. I think I need help." "Hold on, baby," Darius's voice, strained with anguish, boomed through the cabin. "Help is coming. I'm coming. Just hold on." Jessica Morrison was in full-blown panic. She had just discriminated against the daughter of a senior FAA official, endangered a child's life, and done it all in front of a captive audience armed with cell phones. "Perhaps," she offered weakly, "we can work something out." "Work something out?" David Chin's voice dripped with scorn. "You just spent 10 minutes trying to force a child on life support to move seats because she's black, and you didn't think she belonged in first class. What exactly do you want to work out?" The captain, Robert Hayes, alerted by the commotion, emerged from the cockpit. He was met with a chaotic scene: a distraught black child connected to medical equipment, passengers recording the confrontation, and a federal official's voice thundering from a phone on speaker. "What's going on here?" Captain Hayes demanded, his gaze sweeping over the scene. Before Jessica could answer, David Chin interjected. "Your flight attendant has been trying to force this young lady to give up her assigned first-class seat. She's connected to life support equipment, she has all proper documentation, and her father is a senior FAA official who's currently on speakerphone." Captain Hayes assessed the situation in a heartbeat. He saw Kelly, visibly distressed, clearly connected to legitimate medical equipment, holding documentation that appeared official. He then turned to Jessica Morrison, who stood frozen, her face a mask of horror. "Morrison," Captain Hayes said, his voice low and dangerous, "return to your station immediately." "But Captain!" "Immediately!" Just then, the radio crackled with an unprecedented announcement. "Flight 229, this is Chicago Ground Control. You are ordered to return to gate immediately under direct federal order. Do not proceed with departure. Medical emergency and federal investigation in progress." Captain Hayes surveyed the cabin. Kelly struggling for breath. Passengers recording everything. The phone still connected to a federal official who was clearly mobilizing every available resource to protect his daughter. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice calm but firm, "we are returning to the gate due to a medical emergency." He then paused, a grim expression on his face. What followed was an announcement that would send shockwaves through the aviation industry. "Flight 229, this is not a routine return to the gate. You are under direct federal investigation for crew discrimination against a disabled minor. All crew members are to remain in place for federal questioning." Jessica Morrison's career had just imploded. Kelly Bennett's fight for her life was only just beginning, and Major Darius Bennett was about to show the world what happens when you mess with a federal official's child. The phone remained connected as Darius's voice, cold and devoid of emotion, sliced through the cabin. Ms. Morrison, in approximately 2 hours, you're going to be questioned by federal investigators about why you nearly killed my daughter because you didn't think she looked like she belonged in first class. I suggest you use that time to find a good lawyer. As Flight 229 limped back to the gate, as federal investigators prepared to board, as social media erupted in outrage, Kelly Bennett fought for every breath, sustained only by the humming machine and the unwavering love of her father. This wasn't just about comfort. He was going to ensure that no other child would ever face the same life-threatening discrimination. The reckoning was about to begin. When Flight 229 returned to Gate 42, it wasn't just returning to unload passengers. It was returning to face the full weight of federal investigation that would reshape the aviation industry forever. Kelly Bennett was immediately met by a pediatric emergency medical team that had been dispatched from Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, the emergency physician, took one look at Kelly's condition and knew this could have been fatal. "How long has she been in respiratory distress?" Dr. Rodriguez asked David Chin, who had stayed with Kelly throughout the crisis. "About 15 minutes, David replied, "ever since the flight attendant started harassing her about her seat." Dr. Rodriguez checked Kelly's oxygen saturation, heart rate, and breathing patterns. The readings were concerning but not critical. Kelly's equipment had kept her stable, but barely. "We need to get her to the hospital for evaluation." Dr. Rodriguez announced stress-induced respiratory episodes can have delayed complications with her condition. As Kelly was being evaluated by medical personnel, federal investigators were boarding the aircraft. This wasn't a routine incident review. This was a full federal investigation into discrimination and endangerment of a disabled minor. FBI Special Agent Maria Santos led the investigation team accompanied by FAA safety investigators, Department of Transportation and civil rights officers, and airline industry oversight officials. They'd never seen a case quite like this. Racial discrimination, medical endangerment, and abuse of federal authority all rolled into one incident. "Ms. Morrison," Agent Santos began, "you're being questioned under federal authority regarding discrimination against a disabled passenger and endangerment of a minor. You have the right to have airline representation present." Jessica Morrison looked like she wanted to disappear. 12 hours earlier, she'd been a senior flight attendant with a clean record. Now she was facing federal charges that could include civil rights violations and endangering the life of a child. I was just following protocol," Jessica stammered. "What protocol requires you to question a passenger's seat assignment based on their appearance?" Agent Santos asked. "What protocol allows you to ignore medical equipment and documentation?" She looked, she seemed what, Miss Morrison? Black, like she didn't belong in first class. The questions were direct, professional, and devastating because the truth was becoming clear. Jessica Morrison had seen a young black girl in first class and immediately assumed she didn't belong there. Everything that happened after that was based on racial bias, not aviation protocol. Meanwhile, at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, Kelly was being evaluated by her longtime pulmonologist, Dr. Michael Petrosky. He'd been treating Kelly for 5 years and had never seen her experience this level of stress-induced respiratory crisis. "Kelly," Dr. Petrosky said gently, "can you tell me exactly what happened on that plane?" "The flight attendant said I didn't look like I belonged in first class," Kelly replied, her voice still from the respiratory distress. "She wanted to move me to economy, but I tried to explain that my equipment is calibrated for first-class cabin pressure. She wouldn't listen." Dr. Petrosky was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. Kelly's medical condition was serious enough that changes in cabin pressure, altitude, or stress levels could trigger life-threatening episodes. Moving her to a different section of the aircraft wasn't just discrimination, it was medically dangerous. "Has anyone ever questioned your right to use medical equipment before?" Dr. Petrosky asked. "Never." Kelly said, "Dad always makes sure everything is documented. I've flown dozens of times and no one has ever treated me like I was lying about being sick. When Major Darius Bennett's government aircraft landed at O'Hare at 7:30 p.m., he went directly to the hospital. But the man who walked into Kelly's room wasn't just a worried father. He was a federal official who was about to use every ounce of his authority to ensure justice. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Darius asked, taking Kelly's hand. "Better now," Kelly replied. "But Dad, why did she treat me like that? I had all the documentation. I wasn't doing anything wrong." Darius felt his heart break and his anger ignite simultaneously. His 12-year-old daughter was asking why someone had discriminated against her, and he knew the answer was one no child should have to learn. "Some people make assumptions about others based on how they look," Darius said carefully. "And sometimes those assumptions can be dangerous. But what happened to you wasn't okay, and we're going to make sure it never happens to anyone else." By 9:00 p.m., Darius was back at O'Hare, but this time he wasn't there as a father. He was there as Senior Director of Aviation Safety Operations, conducting a federal investigation that would have industry-wide implications. The evidence was overwhelming. Passenger video footage showed Jessica Morrison approaching Kelly aggressively, demanding she move without checking documentation. Phone recordings captured the entire confrontation, including Jessica's statement that Kelly didn't look like a first-class passenger. Most damning was the timeline. Jessica had spent over 10 minutes harassing Kelly about her seat assignment while Kelly was clearly in medical distress. She had ignored obvious medical equipment, dismissed Kelly's explanations, and escalated the confrontation even as Kelly's condition deteriorated. "This isn't just discrimination," Darius told the investigation team. "This is medical endangerment. My daughter could have died because a flight attendant made assumptions based on race and age." The airline's response was swift and comprehensive. Jessica Morrison was terminated immediately. The entire crew was suspended pending retraining. Captain Hayes, who had tried to de-escalate the situation, was cleared of wrongdoing, but required to complete additional sensitivity training. But Darius wasn't satisfied with individual consequences. This incident had exposed systematic problems that went far beyond one biased flight attendant. "We need to look at training protocols," Darius told airline executives during an emergency meeting. "We need to examine how crews are taught to interact with passengers who don't fit their expectations. And we need to understand how someone can nearly kill a child and claim they were following protocol." The investigation revealed disturbing patterns. While Jessica Morrison's actions were extreme, the airline had received numerous complaints about crew members questioning passengers' seat assignments based on appearance. Young passengers, passengers of color, passengers with disabilities, all had reported being made to feel unwelcome or suspicious. Most shocking was the discovery that flight attendants received minimal training on recognizing racial bias, disability discrimination, or medical equipment protocols. They were taught to watch for suspicious behavior, but given no guidance on examining their own assumptions about who looked suspicious. The Federal Aviation Administration, under Darius's leadership, began drafting new regulations that would revolutionize airline training requirements. Mandatory bias recognition training for all crew members, comprehensive medical equipment identification protocols, specific procedures for interacting with passengers with disabilities, severe penalties for discrimination that endangered passenger safety. But the most significant change came from an unexpected source: Kelly herself. 3 weeks after the incident, as she was recovering at home, Kelly asked her father a question that would change everything. "Dad, what if other kids with medical conditions face the same thing I did? What if they don't have a father who can ground airplanes?" That question led to the creation of the most comprehensive passenger rights legislation in aviation history. Working with disability rights organizations, civil rights groups, and medical advocacy organizations, Darius drafted what would become known as the Kelly-Bennett Aviation Equality Act. The legislation included mandatory training on disability rights and medical equipment for all airline personnel, federal penalties for discrimination against passengers with medical conditions, expedited complaint processes for disability-related incidents, requirements for airlines to publicly report discrimination incidents. But Kelly wanted to do more than just change laws. She wanted to change hearts and minds. 6 months after Flight 229, Kelly Bennett became the youngest person ever to address the International Association of Flight Attendants annual conference. Standing before 3,000 airline crew members, she shared her story with the same grace and intelligence that had impressed her doctors for years. "I don't want anyone to lose their job because of what happened to me," Kelly told the audience. "I want people to learn. I want you to understand that when you see a young person or a person of color or someone with medical equipment, you're not seeing a problem to solve. You're seeing a human being who deserves the same respect and dignity as every other passenger." The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. Jessica Morrison, who had lost her job and faced federal civil rights charges, eventually reached out to Kelly through lawyers. She wanted to apologize and to understand how her actions had nearly killed a child. The meeting, facilitated by mediators, was difficult but transformative. Jessica came face to face with the consequences of her unconscious bias, while Kelly demonstrated the grace and forgiveness that had helped her survive her medical condition. "I never thought of myself as racist," Jessica said through tears, "but I realize now that I saw a young black girl in first class and immediately assumed she didn't belong there. I nearly killed you because of my assumptions." Kelly's response was typical of her remarkable maturity. "People make mistakes. What matters is what we do to make sure those mistakes don't happen again." That meeting became the basis for a documentary about unconscious bias in the service industry. Jessica Morrison became an advocate for bias training, speaking at conferences about how assumptions can have life and death consequences. The ripple effects of Flight 229 continued to spread. Airlines across the country implemented new training programs. Disability rights organizations used Kelly's case to push for broader civil rights protections. Medical equipment manufacturers began working with airlines to improve crew education about life support devices. Most importantly, incidents of discrimination against passengers with medical conditions dropped by 80% in the year following Kelly's experience. But perhaps the most significant change was in Kelly herself. The 12-year-old who had been humiliated and nearly killed because of someone else's prejudice had become a powerful advocate for equality and understanding. "I survived because my father had power," Kelly said in a speech to Congress. "But every passenger deserves to be treated with dignity, whether their father can ground airplanes or not." Subscribe to this channel if you believe in justice, because we're about to see how Kelly's advocacy work led to changes that are still protecting passengers today. What happened next proves that sometimes the most powerful response to discrimination isn't anger. It's using your experience to make sure no one else has to go through what you did. Have you ever been discriminated against in a way that felt life-threatening? Share your story in the comments, because Kelly's experience shows us that speaking up can literally save lives. 2 years after Flight 229, Kelly Bennett stood before the United States Congress as the youngest person ever to testify about aviation civil rights. But she wasn't there as a victim. She was there as an expert, an advocate, and a voice for thousands of passengers who'd faced similar discrimination. "Honorable members of Congress," Kelly began, her voice clear and confident, "I'm here today not just to tell you what happened to me, but to talk about what we can do to make sure it never happens to anyone else." The hearing room was packed with airline executives, disability rights advocates, civil rights leaders, and media representatives. Kelly's testimony was being broadcast live and would ultimately be viewed by millions of people worldwide. "When that flight attendant looked at me, she didn't see a passenger with proper documentation and medical equipment," Kelly continued. "She saw a young black girl who she assumed didn't belong in first class. That assumption nearly killed me." Kelly's testimony was remarkable, not just for its content, but for its tone. There was no anger, no bitterness, no call for revenge. Instead, there was a mature analysis of systematic discrimination and concrete proposals for change. She presented data showing that passengers of color were 3 times more likely to have their seat assignments questioned, 5 times more likely to be asked for additional identification, and significantly more likely to report feeling unwelcome on flights. She shared stories from other passengers with disabilities who'd faced discrimination: wheelchairs damaged, medical equipment confiscated, service animals refused. She painted a picture of an industry where unconscious bias was literally endangering lives. But most powerfully, she offered solutions. We don't need to punish people for having unconscious bias. Kelly said, "We need to train them to recognize it. We need systems that protect passengers before discrimination happens, not just consequences after someone gets hurt. Her policy recommendations were comprehensive and practical. Mandatory unconscious bias training for all airline personnel, standardized procedures for passengers traveling with medical equipment, federal oversight of airline discrimination complaints, financial penalties severe enough to motivate real change, public reporting of discrimination incidents to ensure accountability. The congressional response was swift and unanimous. Within 6 months, the Kelly-Bennett Aviation Equality Act had passed both houses of Congress with bipartisan support. It was the most comprehensive aviation civil rights legislation in American history. But Kelly's impact went far beyond legislation. Her story had touched something deep in the American consciousness. The recognition that discrimination wasn't just about hurt feelings or inconvenience. It could literally be a matter of life and death. Airlines began implementing changes before they were legally required. Major carriers invested millions in bias training programs. Flight attendant unions made diversity and inclusion central to their training curricula. Aircraft manufacturers began working with disability advocates to improve accessibility. The aviation industry was experiencing a cultural transformation, and it was being led by a girl who refused to let hatred win. Kelly's college interview at Colorado School of Engineering, which had been interrupted by Flight 229, was rescheduled. But when she finally made it to Denver 6 months later, she wasn't just another prospective student. She was a nationally recognized advocate whose story had changed an entire industry. "Tell us about your interest in biomedical engineering," the admissions committee asked. "I want to design medical equipment that's impossible to ignore or dismiss," Kelly replied. "I want to create devices that are so clearly medical, so obviously essential, that no one could ever look at them and assume they're recreational electronics." She was accepted on the spot, but Kelly's advocacy work was just beginning. Working with her father and the Department of Transportation, she helped create the first national database of aviation discrimination incidents. For the first time, airlines were required to publicly report every complaint about racial bias, disability discrimination, or medical equipment mishandling. The results were shocking. In the first year alone, over 12,000 incidents were reported. Everything from passengers being asked to prove they could afford their seats to life-saving medical equipment being confiscated by crew members who didn't understand what they were looking at. Kelly became the face of aviation equality, speaking at conferences around the world. But she never forgot the personal cost of discrimination or the passengers who didn't have her resources and platform. She established the Kelly-Bennett Foundation, providing legal support for passengers facing aviation discrimination. The foundation's first case involved Maria Rodriguez, a Latino woman with diabetes whose insulin was confiscated by a flight attendant who assumed she was carrying illegal drugs. "Every passenger deserves to travel with dignity," Kelly said at the foundation's launch. "Whether you're flying first class or economy, whether you're black or white, whether you're healthy or dealing with a medical condition, you deserve to be treated like a human being." The foundation's impact was immediate and measurable. Airlines began settling discrimination cases rather than facing Kelly's legal team in court. Crew members started thinking twice before making assumptions about passengers. Most importantly, passengers with medical conditions began feeling safer about air travel. 5 years after Flight 229, Kelly was a freshman at Colorado School of Engineering, studying exactly what she'd planned before her life was nearly ended by someone else's prejudice. But she was also something else, a nationally recognized civil rights leader whose work had protected thousands of passengers. Jessica Morrison, the flight attendant whose bias had nearly killed Kelly, had become an unlikely ally in the fight against discrimination. After losing her job and facing federal charges, Jessica had spent years in therapy and bias training, trying to understand how her unconscious prejudices had led to such a dangerous situation. "I thought I was a good person," Jessica said in a joint interview with Kelly 3 years after the incident. "I thought I treated everyone equally, but when I saw Kelly in first class, my first assumption was that she didn't belong there. I didn't see her documentation, didn't notice her medical equipment, didn't listen to her explanations. I just saw a young black girl and decided she was lying." The interview, which aired on 60 Minutes, became one of the most watched segments in the show's history. But what made it remarkable wasn't the drama of the original incident. It was the transformation of both women. Kelly had grown from a victim of discrimination into a powerful advocate for equality. Jessica had transformed from someone whose bias nearly killed a child into someone who dedicated her life to preventing others from making the same mistakes. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened, Kelly said during the interview. It's about choosing to focus on making sure it doesn't happen again. The statistics spoke for themselves. In the 5 years since Flight 229, aviation discrimination complaints had dropped by 75%. Incidents involving passengers with medical equipment had decreased by 85%. Airlines reported 90% fewer cases of passengers being questioned about seat assignments based on appearance. Customer satisfaction among passengers of color had increased significantly. Medical emergency incidents caused by crew interference had become virtually non-existent. But perhaps the most important change was harder to measure: the shift in culture throughout the aviation industry. Flight attendants were being trained not just to serve passengers, but to examine their own biases. Airlines were hiring more diverse crews and promoting people based on their ability to serve all passengers with dignity. Kelly's story had become required reading in aviation training programs around the world. Her congressional testimony was shown to new flight attendants as an example of how assumptions could literally kill. Her foundation's work was being studied by civil rights organizations in other industries. At 18, Kelly Bennett was no longer just a survivor of discrimination. She was a leader in the fight for equality. She had turned her near-death experience into a movement that had protected thousands of other passengers. But she never forgot the simple lesson at the heart of her story. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of how they look or what others assume about them. Today, when you board an airplane, the respectful treatment you receive from crew members, the protections in place for passengers with medical conditions, the training that prevents discrimination based on appearance, much of that exists because a 12-year-old girl refused to let prejudice kill her or anyone else. Kelly Bennett's portable oxygen concentrator still hums quietly when she flies, but now that sound represents something more than just her survival. It represents progress, justice, and the power of turning personal tragedy into systematic change. The flight attendant, who nearly killed her because she didn't look like she belonged in first class, had inadvertently sparked a revolution. The father, who used federal power to protect his daughter, had helped create laws that protect all passengers. The little girl, who almost died from someone else's assumptions, had grown up to be a powerful voice for equality. Flight 229 was delayed by 6 hours that day, but the changes it created have made air travel safer and more dignified for millions of passengers. That's a delay that saved lives. Kelly's story reminds us that discrimination isn't just about hurt feelings or social awkwardness. When someone makes assumptions based on race, age, or disability, when someone decides that certain people don't belong in certain places, when someone chooses prejudice over protocol, the consequences can be literally life-threatening. But it also reminds us that one person's courage to speak up, to demand better, to transform pain into purpose, can change the world. Every time you see a passenger being treated with respect regardless of their appearance, every time crew members follow proper medical equipment protocols, every time someone chooses understanding over assumption, remember Kelly Bennett. Remember that behind every civil rights victory is someone who refused to accept discrimination as inevitable. Remember that progress happens when people choose dignity over prejudice, when they use their power to protect others, when they turn their worst experiences into fuel for positive change. If this story has opened your eyes to the ongoing fight for equality in air travel and beyond, subscribe to this channel and share Kelly's story. Help us continue telling the stories that matter, the stories that create change, the stories that prove justice is possible when people refuse to stay silent. And remember, the most important safety equipment on any flight isn't the life vests or oxygen masks. It's the respect and dignity we show our fellow passengers, especially those who look different from us or need different accommodations. Kelly Bennett survived because she had a father with power. But every passenger deserves to be treated with dignity, whether their father can ground airplanes or not. That's the lesson of Flight 229. That's Kelly's legacy, and that's why her story matters today, tomorrow, and for every passenger who will ever face discrimination simply for being different. The button that nearly killed her became the catalyst that saved thousands of others. Sometimes the most powerful response to hatred isn't fighting back, it's building something better. Thank you for watching, and remember, when you assume the worst about someone based on how they look, you're not just being prejudiced. You might be endangering their life.